The sky had already gone from gold to gray, the last light slipping behind the trees as Isaiah Brooks stood alone, motionless, beside his wife's fresh grave. He wasn't crying. He hadn't cried when she took her final breath, and he wasn't going to cry now. But the way his hand clutched the folded flag in his chest said more than any tear could. He stood straight, his old spine still holding on to military discipline even after 71 years of storms. His black suit was neatly pressed, his shoes clean. The medals pinned to his chest shimmered faintly under the fading sky. Then came the voice, cold, dismissive. "Sir, the cemetery's closed. I need you to leave immediately." Isaiah turned slowly. A young white officer, maybe 25 at best, stood with one hand near his belt and the other pointing toward the cemetery gate. His badge caught the light. His tone didn't leave room for sympathy. "I'm just saying goodbye to my wife," Isaiah said, voice calm but thick. "I won't be long." "You're already trespassing, sir. It's past visiting hours." The word trespassing hung in the air like an insult. Isaiah looked back at the headstone. Clara J. Brooks, beloved wife, faithful friend. 48 years of marriage, 3 wars survived together, and this was the moment someone dared tell him he didn't belong. "I was at her funeral this morning," he said, quieter now. "They gave me this flag, right there." He pointed to the folded triangle clutched to his chest. The officer's eyes didn't soften. "Sir, rules are rules. Either you leave peacefully, or we'll have to escort you off the property." Isaiah didn't move. Not out of protest, not out of pride, just stillness. His grief had its own gravity, and no badge could pull him out of it. "Young man," he said slowly, "I've fought in 3 wars for this country. I've buried brothers. I've carried the wounded. I've cleaned blood off boots. This here's my wife. I'm not asking for much. Just a moment." The officer's hand dropped a little closer to his holster. "This isn't about your service. It's about policy. I'm going to need you to cooperate." A few people nearby had started to slow their steps. One woman stopped entirely. Her eyes flicked between the officer's stance and Isaiah's calm, unmoving body. The tension was spreading like spilled gasoline. You could smell something was about to catch. Isaiah gave a small nod. "You said cooperate. I'm not resisting. I'm standing. You're refusing a lawful order. I'm saying goodbye." Another voice came from the radio on the cop's shoulder. Something about backup en route. Isaiah heard it. So did the people watching. The officer shifted his stance again. He didn't look afraid. He looked offended, like someone had questioned his control. Isaiah's knuckles tightened on the flag. "You have 5 seconds," the cop said, "before I consider this a situation." Isaiah looked at him and said nothing. That silence was heavier than any scream. By the time the second patrol car rolled up, 3 more people had gathered at a distance. One started recording. Another whispered, "He's just an old man." But the officer didn't back down. He stepped forward, one hand still hovering near his weapon, the other reaching toward Isaiah's arm. And that's when Isaiah finally looked him straight in the eye. "You can arrest me if you want, but you'll have to carry me away from her." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They just watched. One woman wiped her face. Another started filming with tears in her eyes. And the wind moved through the graveyard like even it knew something sacred was being disturbed. Isaiah didn't flinch as the second officer stepped out of the squad car and approached. This one was younger, thinner, and walked like someone who had never been in a fight, but wanted to prove something. The first officer leaned in and muttered something under his breath. The new one just nodded and put on gloves. Isaiah remained still. Not because he was trying to be brave, but because the grief had pressed so hard on his chest, he didn't trust his legs anymore. His knees had locked in place the moment they'd lowered Clara's casket. He hadn't sat down since. He glanced down at the headstone again. Clara's name carved in soft gray, with fresh flowers tucked in the corner. He whispered her name once under his breath, like maybe she could still hear him through the cold dirt. 48 years of marriage. 53 years since they'd met. She was the one who waded through his first deployment, the one who knew which nightmares he couldn't talk about. When his hands trembled after his first combat mission, she held them until they stilled. When he left the army and the world moved too fast, she slowed it down. They were kids when they got married. The courthouse wouldn't allow black couples to wed in the main chapel, so they stood in a side room, alone except for one white clerk, and a witness who barely looked up from his coffee. But Clara smiled like they were standing beneath a cathedral of stained glass. She always saw the good in the ugly. Now she was gone. The second officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we've given you several warnings. I'm asking you to come with us peacefully." Isaiah turned slightly toward them, his back still facing the grave. "You ever lose someone?" he asked. The younger cop blinked. "That's not relevant." "It is to me." "You're refusing again." "I'm saying, this is the last place I'll ever stand with her. And you want to drag me away from it like I'm trespassing on somebody else's property?" The first officer stepped in. "You are trespassing. Grounds are closed. Doesn't matter who's buried here. If you stay, you're resisting." Isaiah let out a breath. "You don't see me, do you?" The two officers exchanged a glance. "I wore this country's uniform longer than you've worn shoes," Isaiah said, voice low. "I've carried men younger than you in my arms, bleeding out. And not once did I think I'd come home just to be ordered off my wife's grave like some thug." The silence hit hard. But policy didn't care about honor, and racism didn't care about medals. The officer reached forward and grabbed Isaiah's arm. Isaiah didn't pull away. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "You're making a mistake." The cop didn't pause. "We'll see about that." As they began walking him toward the patrol car, Isaiah's legs buckled. Not from resistance, but from exhaustion, from heartbreak, from 71 years of holding everything together, and now standing in the only place he'd let himself fall apart. The officers took the stumble as defiance. One shouted, "He's resisting! Get control of him!" Someone in the distance yelled, "No, he's not! Leave him alone!" But it didn't matter. Not to them. The first cop unclipped his taser. Isaiah barely had time to look up before the charge hit him. The shock slammed through his spine like lightning. His body jerked once, hard. The flag fell from his chest. His medals clinked against the pavement. His head hit the ground near Clara's flowers. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. A woman screamed. A man shouted, "You tasered a senior citizen?" He wasn't doing anything. Phones were raised now. Cameras were on. The world had entered the moment. And still, Isaiah didn't fight. He lay there, blinking up at the fading sky, thinking only one thing. Clara would have hated this. Isaiah didn't move. His chest rose slowly, his eyes unfocused. The cold from the ground seeped into his back, but it was the sting of humiliation that burned the deepest. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Get him medical attention!" but the officers stood still. One adjusted his collar. The other holstered his taser like it was just another routine Tuesday. A middle-aged white woman near the gate, holding a bag of groceries, dropped everything and ran toward the grave. "Don't touch him!" one officer barked, stepping forward. She stopped, hands raised, voice shaking. "That man buys roses from my shop every Thursday. For his wife. Don't you dare treat him like this." The cop's hand hovered near his belt again, but the woman didn't back down. Within minutes, more people gathered. A man in a brown UPS uniform stood with his arms crossed. An older black couple whispered prayers. 2 teenage girls were recording from behind the fence. The crowd wasn't loud, but it was growing. And then came the call that changed everything. Tommy Gray, a 22-year-old active-duty Marine stationed nearby, had seen the video clip posted on a local Facebook page. He recognized the man instantly. "Isaiah Brooks," he said out loud, staring at the screen. "That's Sarge." Tommy had met Isaiah at the local VA center a few months earlier. The man didn't talk much, but when he did, the room fell quiet. He was the kind of veteran younger soldiers listened to without being told to. He had the kind of presence that couldn't be taught. Tommy stood up, grabbed his uniform from the back of his chair, and started making calls. Within 10 minutes, 6 other soldiers had left whatever they were doing, a barber's chair, a gym bench, a diner booth, and were heading toward the cemetery. Not to protest, not to fight, to stand. By the time the squad car door opened and one officer started shoving Isaiah inside, 2 black SUVs pulled up along the side of the cemetery. The doors opened one after another. 7 men stepped out, clean, crisp, calm. Their dress blues caught the last of the sunlight. Polished shoes clicked on pavement as they moved with quiet precision. No yelling, no signs, no chaos. Just presence. The lead officer looked up and froze. Tommy walked ahead of the others, his ribbons in full display. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Sir," he said, approaching the first cop. "Is that Sergeant Isaiah Brooks?" The officer blinked. "That's none of your—" Tommy didn't flinch. "I asked a question." The second cop tried stepping in. "You have no authority here." Tommy looked at him, dead in the eyes. "Neither do you. Not like this." He turned toward Isaiah, who was half-seated in the back seat, clearly dazed, but conscious. Tommy took one step forward and held out his hand. "Sergeant, do you need assistance?" Isaiah looked at him slowly. For a moment, his face stayed blank. Then something shifted. Recognition. Respect. Relief. He nodded. Tommy reached into the car and helped him up gently, like lifting a flag off the ground. The other Marines instinctively formed a perimeter, not aggressive, but unmovable. The crowd behind them had gone silent. The young officer stammered, "He's under arrest." "For trespassing." Tommy didn't break eye contact. He had permission to be here. His wife was buried today. You just tased a decorated Army veteran at her grave. One of the Marines pulled up the digital funeral pass Isaiah had tucked into his jacket. Still there, slightly crumpled, but clearly visible. It had the cemetery seal. Approved by management. Time-stamped for that exact day. The cop swallowed hard. Tommy looked back once at Isaiah, then turned to the growing line of witnesses, many now holding up phones. "You all saw it," he said, steady and low. "Make sure the world sees it too." And just like that, the mood shifted. The cops weren't in control anymore. They were surrounded, not by a mob, not by soldiers with guns, but by people who understood the weight of honor. by brothers in arms, by citizens who'd had enough, by justice, quietly arriving in uniform. Tommy didn't yell. He didn't posture. He simply stood tall, facing the officer who now looked visibly unsure. The other Marines behind him adjusted their stance just slightly, shoulders squared, feet planted, military bearing without a single command. One of them picked up the folded flag from where it had dropped, gently brushing off the dust before placing it back in Isaiah's hands. The moment Isaiah's fingers wrapped around it, something inside him seemed to steady. His breathing slowed. His shoulders lifted a little. A quiet authority had entered the graveyard, and it wasn't wearing a badge. The officer who had fired the taser shifted uncomfortably. He looked around for backup that wasn't coming. His radio crackled. "Supervisor en route. ETA 5 minutes." Too late. Tommy didn't say anything else to him. He turned toward the crowd. "My name is Staff Sergeant Tommy Gray. This man here is Sergeant Isaiah Brooks, United States Army. He bled for this country. And today, he came to bury the woman who held him together when this country nearly broke him." The crowd listened in silence. Some had tears in their eyes, some were just angry now. "He stood here to say goodbye," Tommy continued. "And what did he get? A taser to the back. A trip to jail for standing too long beside the woman he loved. That's not law enforcement. That's humiliation. And we won't let that go unanswered." There were murmurs of agreement, nods, and clenched jaws. Someone said out loud, "About damn time." The Marines didn't touch their phones. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Everyone else was already doing it for them. Inside the station, Morrison's supervisor was already reviewing dispatch audio and witness statements. The cemetery director had also been called, alerted by one of the attendees. When the director arrived at the gate minutes later, he pushed through the crowd, breathless and pale. He recognized Isaiah immediately. "He had permission," the director said, his voice raised just enough to be heard. "I signed the pass myself. He was here for his wife's funeral today. There's no trespassing. He has every right to be here." The cop tried to object. "But it was after—" The director cut him off. "You tased a grieving war veteran who had valid authorization to remain on these grounds. You didn't even ask to see it." The crowd erupted. Someone shouted, "Fire him!" Someone else added, "Sue the whole department." The supervisor finally arrived. He looked around at the dozens of people gathered. His eyes took in the uniforms, the phones recording from every angle, the veteran clutching a folded flag while bruised and limping. He didn't say much, just walked to Morrison, pulled him aside, and whispered something that drained the color from his face. Then he walked up to Isaiah. "Mr. Brooks," he said, quieter now, "on behalf of the department, I want to offer our—" Tommy stepped between them. "No," he said firmly. "Not yet. Not until he finishes saying goodbye." The supervisor blinked, then nodded once. Isaiah looked up slowly. The fight in his eyes hadn't disappeared, but now it had company. Respect. Control. Tommy helped him walk back toward Clara's grave. Each step was slow, but deliberate. No limp could take away the weight of those boots. The Marines followed, then stopped a few feet away, forming a silent wall between Isaiah and the officers still lingering behind. Isaiah reached the headstone and stood there, holding the flag tight to his chest again. He didn't speak loud, but everyone heard him anyway. "Clara," he said, "they tried to take the moment from me. Tried to drag me away before I could say the rest." He paused. "But I'm still here, baby." He knelt down slowly, pain obvious in his joints. but determination guiding every move. "I told you I wouldn't miss this. Not even death. Not even disrespect. Not even this country forgetting me could keep me from you." Behind him, the officers stood like statues, silent, still. And in that moment, the graveyard belonged to Isaiah again. Not because someone gave him permission, but because no one could take it from him. The video hit local Twitter before sunset. By midnight, it had over 180,000 views. A 71-year-old black veteran, tased by a white cop while praying at his wife's grave, surrounded by Marines in full-dress uniform. It didn't need editing. It didn't need commentary. The footage spoke for itself. By the next morning, every major news outlet in the region had picked it up. "Veteran tased at wife's funeral," read one headline. "Decorated soldier humiliated by police," read another. But it was the uncut 2-minute clip posted by a teenage girl from the crowd that did the most damage. It started with Isaiah kneeling by the headstone, the flag in his hand, the grave full of silence. Then came the officers, the grab, the taser, the collapse, the cries, and finally, the Marines, stepping in like the final chapter to a story too painful to continue. It wasn't just a police incident anymore. It was a national question. How does a country treat the people who gave everything for it, when no one's watching? Inside the precinct, everything changed. Officer Brent Morrison was pulled from active duty and placed on administrative leave within 14 hours of the event. His badge was locked up. His locker was cleared out. Internal Affairs had opened a file before the second cup of coffee hit the chief's desk. The cemetery director had submitted a full statement. Isaiah Brooks had a printed permit. It had the director's name on it. It was time-stamped. It had been in Isaiah's pocket the entire time. And Morrison never asked to see it. The official charge? Excessive use of force against a non-threatening citizen with a documented military record and legal grounds to be present. But outside the station, real consequences had already begun. Protesters gathered, not screaming, but standing in silence, holding flags upside down, the universal symbol of distress. Veterans from all branches joined in: Black, white, Latino, Army, Navy, Air Force. All of them had one thing in common. They knew how easy it was to be forgotten after service. But being disrespected? That wasn't going to be tolerated. One of the protesters held a sign that said, "If this is how we treat our soldiers, imagine how we treat the rest." By the end of the week, the city council had scheduled an emergency session. Civil rights attorneys had begun drafting paperwork. A lawsuit was coming, and everyone knew it. But before the court hearings, before the apologies, something else happened. The police department changed policy. Effective immediately, no officer could detain or use force on a citizen over the age of 65 without direct approval from a supervisor, unless there was clear and present danger. It was a quiet admission, but it echoed like thunder. The mayor released a statement late Friday afternoon. He didn't try to spin it. He didn't blame protocol or confusion. He said 3 things, and only 3. We failed Mr. Brooks. We failed the honor he carried. We will not fail again. Tommy and the other Marines never gave interviews. They weren't interested in cameras or spotlights. They'd shown up, done what they knew was right, and returned to their lives. But inside the military base, Isaiah's story became legend. Not because he fought back, but because he stood still and made everyone else look away in shame. Isaiah himself didn't speak to the media. He didn't tweet. He didn't film a follow-up. He stayed home, quiet, with a bruised rib and a full mailbox. Letters came in from all over the country, from mothers, veterans, kids who'd never seen a uniform up close, but recognized a hero when they saw one. Most of them started with the same 4 words: "Thank you for standing." And in a country full of noise and division, that silence was louder than any siren. Brent Morrison sat alone in a small room inside Internal Affairs, staring at the paused body cam footage. The freeze frame showed Isaiah Brooks, on the ground, flags scattered beside him, eyes half closed. There was no aggression in the video, no weapon, no resistance, just an old black man, grieving quietly at the grave of his wife. It wasn't defendable, not even by the department's toughest attorneys. Morrison's union rep didn't say much during the meeting, just sat with folded arms while the footage played out in silence. The taser, the fall, the crowd forming, the Marines arriving. By the end of it, the chief of police didn't even raise his voice. "You embarrassed this department," the chief said, cold and flat. "And worse, you disrespected a man who wore this country's uniform before you were even born." Morrison was offered 2 options: resign quietly or face formal disciplinary action that would be made public, along with the footage. He resigned. By the end of the week, his name had been wiped from the official roster. But the stain remained. The city's Civilian Oversight Board issued a public report. It didn't just name Morrison, it named the 2 backup officers who stood by and did nothing. It named the shift sergeant who never responded to the radio call. And it named the training division that failed to include grief-based scenarios in their use of force simulations. The findings were brutal: outdated procedures, cultural incompetency, racism cloaked in standard policy. The city paid attention this time. Public pressure forced them to act faster than usual. A formal apology was issued, on paper and in person. But it wasn't enough. So, the mayor and city council announced a series of emergency reforms: mandatory de-escalation training for all active officers, body cam review audits for every taser use, new civilian intervention board with subpoena power, and a citywide campaign to re-educate law enforcement on veteran protocol. It wasn't just damage control, it was transformation, sparked by the image of one man on his knees in a graveyard while the badge tried to strip him of dignity. The state's attorney general launched a review of the case. Legal experts began crafting a bill, Isaiah's Law, to protect elderly citizens from violent detainment under non-violent circumstances. Meanwhile, across the country, dozens of police departments quietly updated their own guidelines, hoping to avoid the same spotlight. And Isaiah? He didn't care about any of that. He didn't want lawsuits. He didn't want headlines. He wanted peace. But the people didn't let the story go. Black veterans across the U.S. began sharing their own experiences of being treated like criminals despite their years in uniform. Stories came in from Georgia, Ohio, California, even overseas bases where retired black officers spoke of being profiled in their own neighborhoods. Isaiah's moment had become a mirror, and the country didn't like what it saw. When Tommy stopped by a few days later, Isaiah was sitting on his porch, holding a coffee cup that read, "Property of the U.S. Army." He looked better. Still bruised, still quiet, but stronger. "You know," Isaiah said, eyes on the horizon, "when I enlisted, I was just a boy who wanted to wear the uniform. I didn't think about politics, or racism, or dying." Tommy sat beside him. "But now," Isaiah continued, "I realize I didn't just serve overseas. I've been serving all my life, just in a different kind of war. Tommy nodded once. And you didn't lose. Isaiah gave him a look. I didn't win, either. Maybe not for you, Tommy said, but what you did that day, that was bigger than you. They sat in silence a while. A car drove past slowly, then honked once in support. Isaiah didn't wave, but a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen, respected, not by the badge, but by the people the badge was supposed to protect. Justice didn't always look like a courtroom. Sometimes it looked like a folded flag, returned to the hands that earned it. Not because the grass was greener or the flowers were brighter, but because people noticed the grave now. Visitors paused at Clara Brooks's headstone, not out of pity, but out of quiet respect. Isaiah walked the path slowly, flag tucked beneath his arm. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just his old army jacket, the one Clara used to patch every winter. His steps were slower, but deliberate. He stopped beside the grave and knelt, this time without needing help. For a long moment, he said nothing, just placed his hand against the stone, fingers splayed across her name like he could still feel her warmth beneath it. Then he opened his bag and pulled out 7 handwritten letters, each one sealed, each one addressed to a Marine who stood between him and humiliation. He placed them down gently, one by one, beside the flowers. You told me once, he whispered, that I wouldn't always feel alone in this world, that someone would see me for who I am, not what I look like. He exhaled. You were right. From behind, a familiar voice said softly, Sir, permission to approach? Isaiah turned. Tommy stood there, no uniform this time, just jeans, boots, and a quiet smile. Permission granted, Isaiah said, nodding. Tommy stepped forward and handed him a small wooden box. Inside was a polished coin, military issued. On the back was engraved a single word, honor. We had it made, Tommy said. We figured it belonged to you more than anyone else. Isaiah stared at the coin for a while, then tucked it into his pocket without a word. The 2 men sat in folding chairs beside the grave. No ceremony, no crowd, just 2 soldiers and a patch of grass where a woman still lived in memory. You know, Isaiah finally said, I used to think America had forgotten me, that maybe I'd given everything and gotten nothing back. Tommy didn't answer. Isaiah looked at him, but I was wrong. There was no pride in his voice, no victory speech, just peace. You reminded me what it means to have a brotherhood, not of blood, but of purpose. Tommy glanced at the headstone. She was proud of you. That day, everyone saw why. Isaiah nodded slowly. The sun dipped lower. A few visitors passed by. One elderly white man slowed as he walked past, nodded at Isaiah, and simply said, Thank you for everything. Isaiah didn't respond, but he touched the brim of his cap. Respect exchanged. No words needed. Later, as they packed up the chairs and prepared to leave, Isaiah looked back one last time at Clara's name. He didn't feel broken anymore, didn't feel erased. He felt whole. And as he walked away, his back straight despite the pain, he carried no anger with him. Only memory, only love, and the quiet knowledge that they had tried to take his dignity, but couldn't touch his legacy.